Part 1, Chapter 3. They can't do this, Bigger snarled. Goddamn right, agreed Jink. The pit belongs to us. Reef said nothing, just kept looking at the sign painted on the green truck. Scotia Demolition. We turn eyesores into assets. The two men were nowhere in sight, probably around back of the building with their measuring tapes and clipboards. Reef moved down the steps and toward the truck as if wading through deep water, his steps slow and deliberate. Reef? Jink called. What you doing, man? Reef didn't answer. He reached the truck and stood staring at the words on the side. The letters formed from a continuous stylized fuse. The fuse stretched back to a picture of a detonator being pressed by a hand, giving the absurd impression that Scotia Demolition had blown up the rest of the body, along with whatever eyesore had required their attention. Jink and Bigger came down the steps to stand beside Reef. You think they can really do this? Bigger asked. No way, Jink said. No jerks with measuring tapes are gonna tear down the pit. Not while I'm here. Reef turned to them. It ain't them that's doing it. Yeah, they're just the math guys, said Bigger. Engineers, corrected Jink. Right, Bigger agreed. They probably got minimum wages to set the explosives. That ain't what I meant, Reef snapped. They're only the guys paid to take it down. It's the ones who own the pit that are doing it. I didn't think nobody owned it. Reef scowled. Somebody owns it, a-hole. Everything's owned by somebody, even if it's just the city. Bigger picked up a shard of glass glinting on the sidewalk, a fragment of a bottle broken a long time ago. Well, he wowed. I don't care who owns it. It ain't coming down. He glanced towards the street for cars or pedestrians. Seeing none, he strolled over to the truck and held the shard against the back fender, then dragged its jagged edge along the full length of the vehicle. When he had finished, it looked as though there were now two style fuses. The second, a thin white line spelling expletive between the words eyesores and assets. Jink hooted, then pulled a switchblade out of his back pocket. Bending down, he flicked open the blade and inserted it with almost surgical precision into one of the Michelin all-season radials. As the air hissed out, he sauntered around the truck, repeating the surgery on each of the tires while the vehicle settled geometrically to its rims. Reeve grinned, remembering the rock inside his jacket. He reached into his pocket and felt the cool smoothness beneath his fingers, all the while admiring the expanse of windshield before him. He pulled the rock out and eased his arm back, winding up for, "Hey, what are you doing?" All three whirled to see the two men with clipboards running towards them down the alley. One took out a cell phone and punched numbers as he ran. 3 numbers. "Let's get out of here," Reef ordered. "We can take him," said Bigger. "They called 911, Reef hissed. "Cops'll be here in a minute." He jammed the rock back into his pocket. "Come on." He turned and ran. Jink and Bigger followed. "Son of a bee," they heard behind them. "Look what they did to my truck." Jink hooted again, his laughter high and wild as the three raced out of the alley and down the street. Reef looked back to see the man with the cell phone in pursuit. "You lousy punks," he shouted. "Wait till I get my hands on you." He was more agile than his 40-some years had led Reef and the others to expect. More than a block from the pit, the man was still behind them and showing no sign of flagging. It reminded Reef of the times his grandfather would drunkenly roar his name, calling him a good-for-nothing son of a bee. As the boy, he once was cowered outside whatever rat hole they were living in, listening through sobs to his grandmother's gentle voice inside, settling his grandfather, soothing him, making everything all right again, until the next time. "Let's split up," Reef shouted as they pounded down Patterson. He knew they could outrun the truck owner, but there was no sense in prolonging the inevitable. "He'll give up when he can't chase all of us." Bigger grunted and veered to the right, darting into an alley between Bob's house of billiards and a greasy spoon that sold fish and chips wrapped in newspapers. "Later," Jink called, and turned down North Street. Reef looked back and saw the man pause, uncertain. He laughed and, feeling the rock bounce in his pocket, suddenly knew where he was heading. Lisa showed her volunteer parking permit to the attendant at the gate, waited as he raised the barrier, then eased the Subaru out into traffic. She liked rush hour driving, liked constantly having to watch the cars around her weave in and out of openings that appeared and dissolved like eddies in a stream. She didn't even mind the jerks that cut her off without so much as a nod or a wave, so intent on saving those 2 seconds or 3 yards that apparently were worth the risk of collision. Already she'd seen 2 cars pulled over to the side, the red-faced drivers exchanging insurance details over crumbled fenders. Traffic seemed even heavier this afternoon, thanks to a work crew on Elgin Avenue that had diverted drivers to an alternate route on Bentley. Vehicles slowed to a crawl, and without meaning to, Lisa found herself playing the driver game Ellen had invented years ago when they were bored on long drives. She looked at the driver in the Camry on her right, a man in his mid-30s whose face was set in determined lines. He glanced at his watch, grimaced, drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, glanced at his watch again. Robert, murmured Lisa. Divorced. Promised he'd take his kids to their soccer game. In her rearview mirror, she saw a woman with blonde hair piled high on her head driving a battered Buick Century. Raylene, Mary Kay representative, still hoping for the pink Cadillac. A horn blew somewhere up ahead, followed by a squeal of tires as a blue Durango beat a yellow light. The Camry turned right and a minivan took its place, the air around it throbbing with bass. A boy about her age played air drums and bopped his head to the beat of an urban rap. Too easy, she could hear Ellen say. Lisa shook her head, rose to the challenge. Kyle, just got his license, first time out alone without his mom. She grinned. Tough to be cool in a minivan, Kyle. She imagined Ellen laughing, her teeth perfectly white. Before the medications darkened them, turned them the sallow color of legal notepads. Lisa gripped the steering wheel, tried to swallow round a sudden fist in her throat. She stared straight ahead, refusing to look at other drivers jockeying for space around her. Reef took another look over his shoulder. Nothing. He hadn't seen the guy with the cell phone since he'd cut through the vacant lot behind Fishman's. About time. The man had stuck with him so long after Reef had figured he'd given up and go home. Pain in the back. Reef hated it when things interfered with his plans. He waited another moment just to be sure, then turned left on Belcher. Lisa listened to the steady tink-tink-tink of the turn signal as she waited for the light to change, grateful to see traffic flowing steadily on Carver. She decided to shortcut her way home, no longer interested in the extended play version of the drive. Without realizing it, she glanced at her watch again, grimaced, leaned back against the headrest. The traffic light glowed immutably red. She fought to keep from drumming her fingers on the steering wheel. Reef stood on the overpass above Birmingham, his hand in his jacket pocket, squeezing and releasing the rock. The thing he liked about Park Street was its lack of traffic, especially during rush hour. Most of the traffic was on the multi-lane outbound highway that ran perpendicular to it. The people who used Park Street and this overpass were mainly those who lived in the few houses scattered along its length and people heading toward the green belt at its south end. And rush hour wasn't a time many people headed toward the park, which suited Reef just fine. He didn't need an audience for what he was about to do. The stone fit in the hollow of Reef's palm like a piece of puzzle, an extension of his own hand. Reef had loved rocks for as long as he could remember. Not that there were many around the places he lived. The tenements he'd called home over the years had been surrounded by concrete and asphalt, oceans of hardness. It was his grandmother who had somehow made the hardness bearable, and it was she who had placed the first stone in his hand. He'd been almost 5 and they'd been on the way to Truro in the old Dodge Dart his grandfather drove. Reef had grown carsick and his grandfather had had to pull over on the 102 so he could puke. Car after car whizzed by as he retched on the side of the road, his grandfather cursing him, warning him he'd better not throw up in the car if he knew what was good for him. During the tirade, Nan slipped down into the ditch where she moved aimlessly about in the long grass like someone lost. When she returned, she had it in her palm, a small round stone as smooth as glass. "It's a 6 stone," she explained when his grandfather had gotten back in the car. She placed it in Reef's hand and closed his fingers over it. "When you feel like you're gonna throw up, just squeeze it hard. It'll take the sick feeling away." It worked. Each time the waves of nausea rolled over him, he gripped that stone like a lifeline, trying not to watch his grandfather's thick fists pound the horn at whoever was stupid enough to cut him off. And each time he squeezed the rock, he felt stronger, like he was somehow in charge, like he felt right now. There had been other 6 stones after that, and stones whose purpose was to prop open doors, to hold up windows, to let the breeze blow through, to level a chrome table whose leg had bent when his grandfather had rammed it against the kitchen wall. And then there had been stones that had no purpose except to be stones. In the months following that afternoon on the 102, he'd started bringing home rocks he found on the playground, adding to his collection Nan helped him hide in his closet. When his grandfather wasn't home, the two of them would take the rocks out and arrange them on the kitchen table, sorting them according to color and texture and size. There were always rocks that didn't seem to fit into groups Reef would devise, and these they loved the best. These are special stones, Nan would tell him. Just because they don't fit in with the others, don't make them less important. It was then he'd realize she was talking about more than just stones, and he'd wait for her to get that faraway look in her eyes when she'd begin to speak about the girl who had been his mother. The girls whose deafness had made her different, had set her apart, had trapped her in a world of silence and shame. Reef shrugged, pulled out the rock he'd carried with him all afternoon. Turning it over in his hands, he thought of the night 2 years ago when Bigger had coined his name. They'd been passing around a joint, and Reef, who at the time was still Chad Kennedy, had taken the final shred of it from Jink for one more drag. Already high, he sucked too strongly on it, pulling the burning remnant inside his mouth. Jink and Bigger had rolled on the ground, quaffing as he choked and spat and cursed, his tongue already swelling from the burn. "Man, you're one hell of a toker," Jink had sputtered through his laughter. "Yeah, man," echoed Bigger. "You're the Grim Reefer." "Hey, Reef." Reef had liked the name, but not for the reason Jink had Bigger thought. Years earlier, Reef's 4th grade teacher had shown his class a science film on coral, and while nearly everyone else had dozed or whispered in the dark, Reef had sat mesmerized by the images of living rock that formed protective barriers around tropical islands. He liked what a reef could do, liked thinking of himself as living rock, like pretending that it was possible to protect those you love. In the end, he hadn't been able to save the one person who'd meant everything to him. Had to watch the cancer burn her up, her body like an ember that crumbled into ash. Horns below him on Birmingham brought him back to the overpass, and he looked down at the traffic through tear-filled eyes. He gripped the rock, seeking its strength, and chose a target. The traffic was moving more steadily now, picking up speed as it neared the Park Street overpass. Lisa glanced up and saw 2 figures there, one on the end with his hand to his ear, and the other in the middle with the one arm up waving at her. Amused, she raised her hand to wave back. Then something hit her windshield and the world exploded.